Aloha and welcome back to ThinkTech Hawaii. I'm your host, Hillary Weinberg, and I'm here today again with retired Navy Captain and military historian Carl Schuster. Carl, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me back.
Today we're going to talk about, in honor of the 74th anniversary of Pearl Harbor, we're going to discuss Pearl Harbor, some analysis and implications, long-term implications that the attack had, not only including the U.S.'s involvement in World War II, but also complete restructuring of East Asia. So we're really happy to have you.
Thank you. It's good to be back. One of the things as we look at Pearl Harbor, traditionally we look at it from the American perspective, what we did wrong, and at a tactical level, what they did wrong. But when you think about it, the impact of the attack was an impact on both World War II. It brought the United States into the war. It also put us on the path to become a superpower. But the other effect it had, although this was not the Japanese intention, was the outbreak of the war in the Pacific and the campaigns that followed convinced the local populations in Southeast Asia and East Asia, and indeed South Asia, that the Europeans could be defeated. And having helped us fight the Japanese, we armed them to fight the Japanese, that engendered a mindset, why are we fighting to have another group resume their occupation and domination of us? And so, to a great extent, in addition to the U.S. becoming a superpower, World War II in the Pacific deconstructed the colonial networks and system that existed in Asia before the war. And many of the countries that are independent today owe their independence to at least the inspiration of what happened in World War II, if not actually the balance of power when it was over.
So which countries do you think are the greatest example of this?
Well, you look at Malaysia, India, Indonesia. Indonesia certainly so. In fact, Indonesia was the second country in Asia to get its independence. We had already promised the Philippines that they would have their independence in 46 to 47. We made that promise when Mr. Aguinaldo defected back in the late teens. And so Philippines got its independence, then Indonesia. They overthrew the Dutch. The Vietnamese started fighting for their independence in 1946, and they got it by 1956. North Vietnamese, South Vietnam, they split. Of course, Korea was a colony of Japan, and so North Korea and South Korea gained their independence under separate spheres, but nonetheless independence. The power struggle in China, the stage for the final settlement of that struggle was shaped by World War II. India got its independence. There's some argument as to whether it was due to just the fact Britain was in the war. The Japanese connection is something in debate, but nonetheless, India got its independence as a result of World War II, so did what's now called Myanmar, Vietnam, Laos. All of them, the stage was set for their independence by that war.
Wow, and this is really fascinating because the way World War II played out, and we're always worried about World War III, what's going to happen with World War III. There were so many less players. I mean, there were a few major countries, whereas now, yes, there are the largest powers. Of course, the United States, China, the UK, but the sum of the parts when it comes to all these other countries is much greater than their whole.
Oh, indeed. I mean, when you think about it, the war in the Pacific actually started in 1931 with the Marco Polo Bridge incident and the Japanese invasion of China. But at that time, China was considered essentially a failed country. It was riven by civil war. Sections of it were still dominated by warlords in a bigger scale than we see in Somalia now, but in a very similar fashion. There were people who had loyal troops to them that controlled areas of China. The nationalists nominally commanded the whole country, but there were parts of China that Chiang Kai-shek's troops couldn't go into because he didn't want to challenge the warlord in that area. So the Japanese invasion, although it ultimately served the People's Republic's interest, the Communist Party's interest, it also contributed to the set of circumstances that ultimately led to the unification of mainland China under one rule. In this case, of course, the Chinese Communist Party.
It just shows how much we we don't know what effect our actions will have. I mean, now Japan is, still a very large economy, still very important on the world stage, but there's nothing compared to China.
Indeed, and to a great extent, Japan's defeat shaped their approach to dealing with problems, because they probably they in Germany were saddled with the guilt of World War II, largely legitimately. For them, a use of military force was domestically an anathema, as well as regionally. And so it wasn't until the 1990s when they were facing both criticism for not participating in UN operations, not contributing to the global security order, but also when their participation became nominally acceptable. Until that point was reached, Japan focused on providing money and resources to the UN or the US to solve a problem. The first Japanese UN observers were, of course, in Southwest Africa and South Africa to monitor the peace, the agreement between Nelson Mandela and de Klerk that led to South Africa as we know it today. But those were only like a dozen observers. Cambodia was the first major peacekeeping deployment. And of course, the Japanese minesweepers in the Persian Gulf in the mid-90s to clear away the mines from the Persian Gulf War. So it took 40 years for Japan to shed a combination of the guilt and the political malaise that came out of World War II. Japan today is a completely different country than it was in 1941.
Well, on that note, let's dial it back and start with the attack on Pearl Harbor.
Okay. Started at approximately 48 minutes after 7 in the morning on the 7th of December. First wave of aircraft had 183 planes in it. Most of them, a high proportion of them were fighter aircraft because they weren't sure if they achieved total surprise. And they went after the fleet and the fighter fields. It was a very effective attack, but to give you an idea how effective, and let's bring up slide 1, which shows the cost and losses from that day. Now, as you look at that, you will notice we had 2 battleships destroyed permanently. We had 6 severely damaged. Most of the severely damaged were brought back into service by 1943. Japan, of course, if you look down the right, they lost almost nothing. Most of their losses were midget subs. They had 4 that were sunk and 1 that was captured, and 29 aircraft. So if you look at it from a military unit perspective and a human casualty perspective, it's a very lopsided Japanese victory. The other thing, too, if you look at the bottom, you'll notice in terms of monetary costs, which in this case is limited only to the cost of the military equipment that was lost or destroyed, and this is in today's dollars, we lost $44 billion worth of military materiel in today's dollars, and the Japanese lost about $109 million. And so from a monetary cost perspective and a military cost perspective and a human cost perspective, it's an overwhelming Japanese tactical victory. But at the strategic and operational level, the equation shifts against Japan. We've talked about the long-term strategic impact, brought the U.S. into the war, and we became a superpower as a result. But the immediate strategic impact was it not only brought us into the war, but it mobilized us to the extent that ultimately led to Japan's defeat. The other thing was, in doing so, Japan set the stage for their own defeat. Their whole doctrine was based on being tactically superior to their opponent and selecting their battles carefully. After Pearl Harbor, the stage was set for us to enter, and then later, after the Battle of Midway, the initiative shifted to us. And so once we secured Guadalcanal at the end of 1942, the war increasingly shifted against Japan, and their strategy shifted from finding a defensible terrain and holding it to inflicting such losses that we would give up the effort.
This is all great, and it's really interesting to hear a more detailed historical view, but also like bringing it back and discussing how it is affecting military strategy today. However, we do have to cut for a break.
Indeed.
We'll be right back.
Dig it. And then we'll...
Hi, I'm Chris Leatham, and I'd like to invite you to come and watch my show every Wednesday at 3. I'm interested in a variety of issues that have have to do with politics and our local business economy. And I'd like to bring on guests who like to talk about everything from technology to social media to what we can be doing to improve our environment. And so I'd like to invite you every Wednesday at 3 to stay and watch my show here with ThinkTech Hawaii. And I'll see you there.
Hi, my name is Cindy Matsuki, and I host the show High Growth with HTDC on ThinkTech Hawaii. This is the show where we talk about all things tech, innovation, entrepreneurship, and manufacturing, because there's so many things going on in Hawaii and more people should know about them. So this is the program that you can come and find out about all the things happening in Hawaii. And this show also airs on Olelo 54 along with ThinkTech Hawaii. And it broadcasts live every other Tuesday at 3 p.m. So don't forget, check out the show Tuesday, 3 p.m. every other week. High Growth with HTDC. Thanks.
Welcome back to The Whole Gamut. I'm Hillary Weinberg, here with Carl Schuster. We're discussing Pearl Harbor and its effects, long-term effects on the Pacific region as well as U.S. military. So let's talk about that. What effects specifically on U.S. military did Pearl Harbor have?
One of the things Pearl Harbor settled was the nature of naval operations. Before Pearl Harbor, there was some debate as to whether battleships were still the capital ships or we should shift to an air power-based naval doctrine. Pearl Harbor settled that. We didn't have the battleships to do gun battles, if you will. We had to rely on our carriers. In Europe, the debate was still going on because the Germans were able to sink several British aircraft carriers with their battle cruisers, where they surprised them. But the distances in Europe are a lot closer. For example, it's only 200 miles from Britain to Norway, which is where the Germans caught one of the British aircraft carriers. Pacific, whole different ball game. If you couldn't strike your enemy at long range, they could do you a lot of damage before you got in gun range. And so for us, as we looked at it, we had no battleships except for a handful on the East Coast. And Europe was first, so we couldn't move the battleships back from Europe because battleships still had a relevant role in European waters. So Coral Sea became a carrier-oriented battle, and then Midway settled the debate once and for all. And of course, aircraft carriers have now been the capital ships ever since. And every country that thinks in terms of projecting naval power ashore takes one of two approaches: an aircraft carrier or cruise missiles on another type of combatant, depending on the nature of what kind of power projection they want to do. That's what Pearl Harbor settled in terms of our doctrine. The other was it opened our eyes to the fact that the Japanese were very well trained and not technologically inferior. Prior to Pearl Harbor, the feeling was the Japanese were completely risk averse, entirely defensive, and that their expertise in flying aircraft was inferior to ours. Pearl Harbor and the battles that followed completely destroyed that myth. By the time by the time Midway was over, we took the Japanese for what they were: a very tough, dedicated, highly trained force.
So let's talk a little bit about the strategic setting.
Okay. Well, the Japanese were on shall we say, a series of aggressive actions. We were trying to get them to stop their aggression in China. From about 1900 to about 1949, we had a special relationship with the Chinese. We were considered the sentimental imperialist power. And we were very sensitive to anyone bullying China. And so,
how the world changes.
Indeed. And so here were the Japanese. They'd taken over Manchukuo, or Manchuria as it's known today, and they were invading mainland China, the massacre at Nanjing. And the Roosevelt administration, America was an isolationist population before then. Culturally, we were isolationists. We didn't want to be involved with the world. We didn't want to be imperialists like these other European powers. We weren't even comfortable hanging on to the Philippines. That's why we promised them independence. And so we wanted to pressure the Japanese into pulling out of China. So in July 1940, we seized Japanese assets in the U.S. We stopped shipping of scrap iron. Then the Japanese rolled into Indochina in July of 1941. In May of 1940, as one of what we call today, force deterrent options. to make the Japanese think twice about doing anything in the Pacific, we moved the Pacific Fleet from San Diego to Hawaii in May 1940. Small problem. In July 1940, Hawaii was supposed to get 2 radars and 3 squadrons of P-39 fighters. Instead, we put them in Iceland. And the reason was Roosevelt's advisors, particularly the Army Air Force advisors, were afraid, as were the British, that the Germans would take Iceland. And from Iceland, you can strike New York. And so we decided to take over the defense of Iceland, and we deployed the radars and fighters there instead of sending them to Japan. The result was instead of to Hawaii. So Hawaii didn't get the radar until late summer 1941. Also, patrol aircraft that were supposed to go to Hawaii went to Iceland. And we started building airfields in Greenland. So we were looking to set up, if you will, an air wing to cover, an air umbrella to cover what we called our neutrality zone, which reached out about 300, then later 1,000 miles from the U.S. coast. Hawaii, however, had the fleet, and you had an Army commander and General Short, and you had a fleet commander, Admiral Kimmel. Both men, they were both actually very good officers, but they were very narrow in their interpretation of modern warfare. Short was more worried about an amphibious assault than an aerial assault. And if you look at the evidence available to him, probably most people of that era would have come to the same conclusion. Kimmel was a gunnery expert. His view for fighting the Japanese was to take the fleet out of Hawaii and fight them in the open ocean, with the carriers staying back and providing only reconnaissance support, and he was going to take them on with guns. So in many ways, the Pearl Harbor attack, if I may speak operationally for a moment, it's a good thing we were caught in port. Because if they'd been sunk in the open ocean, we never would have recovered them and used the battleships again. The other thing, too, is if we could bring up the second slide of the map of the Pacific Ocean, see where the Pacific Fleet moves forward. Now, the blue circles represent U.S. military bases, and the red circles represent the Japanese bases. The 2 lower bases are Rabaul and Truk. And so what you see here is our bases and facilities lie between Japan and the possessions they were given at the end of World War II. When the Japanese moved into Indochina, President Roosevelt initiated an embargo of oil. We were Japan's sole source for oil, and they only had, depending on who you read and believe, 6 to 9 months supply of oil in their country. And so for them, they had to make a sudden decision. Do we pull out of China? Indeed, there was some negotiations. And our final offer was, you pull all forces out of Indochina and China, and we'll resume the shipments. Well, the Japanese militarists didn't find that acceptable, so they started looking for alternatives. So in July 1941, actually, some of the planning started before then, they started looking at alternate sources for raw materials. And of course, those raw materials were in Southeast Asia. Dutch East Indies, today Indonesia, the oil there, tin, copper, other key materials in Malaya and Burma. Vietnam was a major source of gold, iron ore, and coal, as well as the oil from China. And so for Japan, the military planners looked at it and said, okay, we're going to go after that, the so-called Southern Resource Region. But there was a problem. You'll notice we had bases in the Philippines. If we decided to enter the war and prevent them or somehow undermine their effort down there, then they would find themselves fighting a 2-front war against the remaining European forces in Asia and us. So that led to the planning requirement that the U.S. had to be eliminated as a factor early on.
This is interesting because if you look at the major issues in the world today, the South China Sea, China is very concerned about its ability to ensure supplies coming through there. Mm-hmm. You're saying that Japan was pushed to attack us in 1941.
Well, that's certainly their view.
Right. Well, according to them, that's how they were.
And the lesson learned from that is when you develop a policy, there is a tendency to think only of your side of the argument. Mm-hmm. You expect the other side to behave in the way you think you would in their circumstances. And so far, over the last 100 years, that's not been the case. As we say in the military, the enemy gets a vote. And they never think of, I'm going to back down and surrender these guys because they have some decisive leverage. If they have the ability to hit us, they'll look for a way to do it. The Japanese, doing that to the Japanese, we did that to a country who had the capability to hurt us. We just didn't believe it. And so the Pearl Harbor attack was intended to have two effects. One was military, eliminate the Pacific Fleet as a factor in the Japanese offensive in the South. The second was to inflict such a serious psychological blow that we would not enter the war, that we would become defensive in nature and we would not recover militarily.
So it seems that the Japanese also did the same thing,
Exactly right.
the same mistake we've made. They didn't really seem to understand American decision making.
Indeed, nor did the Germans. Most of the people who looked at us figured, this is not a homogenous country. They'll divide up anytime they're under stress, and that certainly wasn't true in those days. I personally don't think it's true today. So when that failed at Pearl Harbor, that's when the Battle of Midway became important. The Japanese plan for Midway was if they could destroy the surviving aircraft carriers, the bulk of the U.S. fleet, remaining fleet in the Pacific, and take the island of Midway so that we couldn't sortie from Japan unobserved, that we would seek peace terms. And from their perspective, to give you an idea how dire that requirement was, I'll just pick two economic facts. Japan, even after they captured Indonesia and Burma, only had access to 10 million tons of oil a year. We used to export 6 million tons a month, okay? And we produced 140 million tons of oil that year.
So Japan was, again an example of when oil has influenced decision making in wartime.
Indeed. The other thing was Japan had access to and production of about 11 million tons of steel per year. The United States produced 14 million tons a month. So they were taking on a country whose economy was so much larger than theirs that it's almost no comparison. And so the whole war to them boiled down to we have to be technologically superior, we have to be more powerful, we have to be better trained, we have to be elite, only an elite force of smaller size can defeat them, and we have to break their political will early. And that didn't happen. And so from Midway on, we had the initiative. And as you can see from the strategic setting, Japan geographically was only at an advantage in the Western Pacific, not in the Eastern Pacific. So they were able to hold on to their bases at Rabaul and Truk almost to the end of the war. We never went after them because they were too heavily defended. But if you look at that map, you can kind of see why the Japanese took the approach they did. Oil and all the raw materials were to the southwest. Our military forces were to the east. They couldn't afford to go after both simultaneously. So take us out, then shift southwest, and they'll win. That was their view.
So let's talk about why the U.S. didn't know. I mean, obviously technology was very different then. They didn't have UAVs, they didn't have satellites, they didn't have satellite images, they didn't have the internet. So how did the U.S., so it seems like it was a lot easier to not foresee this, but what happened there?
Well, there were a lot of little indicators, none of which directly pointed to Hawaii per se, but some of the same mistakes made in 9/11 were made prior to the attack on Pearl Harbor. Although we never look at what the Japanese were doing to confuse the picture. They actually ran a very good deception plan. But if we could flip up the next slide, the Pearl Harbor I&W slide, the first one, June 1941, you'll notice that they were doing things that told us something was up. They prohibited all the attachés from attending exercises and training. So we could no longer track what they were working on, their proficiency, their basic tactical training, any kind of work with new equipment, basic fleet maneuvering or anything. Also, our ambassador heard rumors of plans to attack the Pacific Fleet. You could argue, well, that should have told us Pearl Harbor, but in fact, the Pacific Fleet in those days used to regularly sortie into the Central and Western Pacific. And the next one is, of course, their merchant shipping started passing Singapore from the Indian Ocean and going back to Japan. Withdrawing your merchant fleet from global trade is an indicator that you're trying to preserve those assets from something. You don't just do it on a whim because it costs so much money. You lose money by recalling your merchant ship. And so that was an indicator they were up to something. Then in August, I'm sorry.
Oh, it's time to cut for a break.
Okay.
We'll be right back. See you in a minute.
Indeed.
Mahalo for watching ThinkTech Hawaii. We are a channel dedicated to raising public awareness about the importance of technology, energy, diversification, and globalism to the future of Hawaii. We broadcast and stream daily from 1 to 5 every weekday, and we broadcast on Olelo 54 and OC16 TV. All of our shows are archived on thinktechhawaii.com, and we hope to see you there. Aloha.
This is Alice Lee Hagan, host of ThinkTech Hawaii Business Education Spotlight. My show here at ThinkTech Hawaii is every Thursday from 3 to 4 in the afternoon. I bring in interesting guests from Hawaii, the mainland, and hopefully international guests in the future. Do join us on Thursday from 3 to 4 p.m. ThinkTech Hawaii Business Education Spotlight. Aloha.
Hi, I'm Ethan Allen. I'm the host of Likeable Science on ThinkTech Hawaii. We talk about why people should like science, why science is actually fun, how science is a dynamic and vital part of everyone's life, why everyone, every man, woman, and child on the planet should really know science, should love science, should be familiar with science. So it's a great show. People come on here and have interesting conversations with us. They tell us why they do what they do, why they love it, why we should love it too. I hope you'll join us every Friday, 1 to 2 p.m. And of course, you can see it anytime on YouTube. Aloha.
Welcome back to The Whole Gamut. I'm your host, Hillary Weinberg. I'm here with retired Navy Captain Carl Schuster, and we're discussing Pearl Harbor. And right before the break, you said something very interesting, that there are parallels between the mistakes made before 9/11 and mistakes made before Pearl Harbor. Let's go into that.
Indeed. If we could bring up the slide again, you'll notice in August 1941, the FBI arrested a German double agent, Dusko Popoff, and one of the things German intelligence had given him was a Pearl Harbor questionnaire. Depth of the harbor, nature of the defenses, anti-torpedo defenses, and various things that we would need information, questions you would need answers to conduct an attack. However, Herbert Hoover didn't trust Dusko Popoff, and he particularly didn't trust the British. And so the questionnaire was not shared with anyone until after World War, until after he died. And so that questionnaire, no military service, State Department, or the President were aware of it. And one could argue that if they had been, they never would have thought that, what did the Germans care about Pearl Harbor? The other thing, too, is if you look at the very next thing, Japanese staged aircraft into Indochina, attack aircraft, large numbers, and in fact, an entire air division. One of two things, that would be a precursor to one of two things, either an attack on the Philippines or an attack further south. Most of our intel analysts, that meant that they were looking to hit the Europeans in the south because their garrisons were denuded. They didn't have many fleet units there. Their airplanes were obsolete and not very numerous. The thought that that might be an indicator of a general outbreak of war was not considered. And then there were other indicators as well. For example, if we go to the next slide, the Japanese changed their naval code in September 1941. And then they started passing troops through Thailand that month. And then in September, they initiated a fleet-wide radio silence. Now, the DC authorities, both Navy and Army, issued an alert, theater-wide alert, every time one of these things happened, saying, be on alert, the Japanese are about to do something. And then nothing happened. And so I would say by the middle of October, maybe late October, people in the fleet particularly, were beginning to think these alerts were useless, and they began to take them increasingly lightly. And then as time advanced, you take a look at October, for example, Japanese changed their call signs. That's normally indicative of you're trying to hide something or initiate offensive action. One of the things the Japanese did that month that no one talks about is they took the radio operators off their carriers and the carrier strike group and put them on a ship and had them continue broadcasting in the waters off Japan to make it appear as if the carriers were still in home waters. The carriers left port in radio silence. And so there was fleet-wide radio silence on the 30th of November, which led to the initiation of another alert. But in fact, the carriers have been radio silent since they left Japan on the 17th. So we were still focused on the carriers being in home waters because all indications we had, which was mostly long-haul communications, was that the Japanese carriers, the strike force that could hit us, was in home waters. And so we didn't give any thought to them coming here.
So with all these points you're making, it seems so obvious now. But what happens that this type of information slips through the cracks? I mean, is there just so much information, especially during World War II, where there was just like this worldwide conflict? I imagine it was one of those times that everyone in every intelligence agency was working 24 hours a day, et cetera. Was it just there was too much information? Were people who pointed this out being told, oh, this isn't important?
It's a mixture of that, although keep in mind, every generation thinks the amount of information they're handling is overwhelming.
Right.
For today, for example, in the Pentagon, there's about 4 million emails flying around per day. In 1941, there were 25,000 messages.
Right.
And many consider that an overwhelming amount. But the other problem, here's the irony of 1941. In Washington, D.C., Army and Navy signals intelligence worked very closely together. They shared information. Out in the Pacific, on the other hand, MacArthur and Short had their info. Kimmel and Hart had their info. And so there was a pipeline as you went further west. Part of that was because each of the services was allocated a set of frequencies to use. And therefore, a Navy wasn't likely to transmit on an Army frequency. And that led to, okay, I've got this, but they didn't have extra equipment where they could load it up, send it to an Army unit, even if they wanted to. Their fleet exercises were held separately from Army exercises. And so there was no practicing working together, and there was no mindset of working together except at the national level. And so you get into this situation where, and look at what the FBI did. They had a pretty significant decisive indicator that never went past the FBI until after the war, long after the war. And so people were operating with a portion of the picture, and they stayed on the portion of the picture they understood, and they interpreted it in the way that they thought what it meant to them if they were in charge of the other side. So a lot of mirror imaging. The next critical indicator came on the 6th of December. The Japanese consulate in Hawaii started burning huge amounts of paper. But it wasn't noticed or reported. No one paid any attention to it. We weren't watching the consulate. And so once again, that's a fact that became critical after the attack. But the advantage of investigating after the attack is the attack occurred. You don't necessarily see all the noise and misleading information. For example, when they investigated the Pearl Harbor attack, they completely discounted the Japanese deception effort because they knew it was a deception effort.
So we look back at all these, the espionage movies from the 1930s, 1940s, and through the Cold War, and then you also look at what's going on today, where there's a lot of mistrust between obviously different countries, different people. I mean, even in all these movies, I'm thinking of like Tinker, Tailor, Soldier, Spy, where in between people, there's always a double agent. Do you think this type of thought, because it creates these pipelines?
To an extent, but a lot of it too is, and it's not endemic to just that era. I'll give you another example. That ambassador's rumor was reported through the State Department. State Department had no intel relationship with the military, so they might have told President Roosevelt, but they certainly didn't tell the military. We have a similar case in 1999. One of the reasons the Chinese didn't take us seriously when we said we didn't know it was their embassy is because they had hosted a State Department delegation at that embassy 2 weeks before we bombed it.
Right.
And so for their minds, wait a minute, we hosted a bunch of American diplomats when the embassy opened, but that goes up through State Department channels and it didn't get shared with the military. Over on the military side, that building was better known as the headquarters for the Yugoslavian foreign arms sales. And it was owned, at the time we had initiated the information on it, by Milosevic's wife. She and several of her relatives made money from that. So hitting it and removing their ability to move and sell arms and also inflict monetary damage on them seemed like a smart idea. And the problem is, In the current system, you have a target list. Those are the targets you know you're going to hit. You update them regularly, so you know the latest status of what's on the target list. You don't have the latest status on what's on the list of targets, which is every potential facility someone might use in a country. And there's a scale of difference between them. A target list is typically no more than 2,500 targets.
Yeah.
A list of targets can have up to 100,000.
And you see, because the U.S. government is so large, I mean, if information is just being funneled up to the president, well, he's going to react to the crisis. I mean, if you look today, even just the headlines today, probably what's on his desk is ISIS, guns, maybe a few economic things, maybe something about China. But there's so much other information. There's so many things happening all around the world today. What is slipping through? Makes you wonder what is slipping through the cracks.
Oh, indeed. And the other thing too is, picture the results of the Manning case and Snowden. As a result of Manning was able to exploit the fact we were all sharing our secret information on the same computer system. So he was able to download State Department reporting, military reporting, FBI reporting. And when that came to light, everyone looked at it and said, wait a minute, we shared our information and it went everywhere. It wound up on the internet. So then they started putting the walls back up. The Snowden case is even more damaging. And so people started looking at, okay, now how do we restrict access to data so that the next collection program won't be compromised? And so we go through this cycle between open sharing and then somebody exploits it to a negative purpose. Right. And we wind up looking for security. The other issue is all decision makers have gatekeepers, people that know what the boss wants and they try to shape what the boss sees. One of the ways we dealt with that in Intel when I was an Intel officer is we tried to get the main points down on a single page. If the guy could read it in under a minute, if he wants to ask questions, be ready to answer. Right. But the basic, most significant information, it's very hard to do it, but if you can't put it on a single page, then maybe you haven't thought it through, because the decision maker can't waste a lot of time digging into details. He or she needs to know the most significant facts and the impact before they make a decision on something. And so you need to find a way to cap it down.
Right, and that is, like when I've worked with the military, it's so easy to shape what they see, because if you're giving a presentation on something and there's for example, anything with China, there's so much information out there. How do you pare it down? What are the statistics that you show? What are the statistics you don't show? And your analysis is what they see. Because often they don't care about the statistics. They're like, okay, what does this mean, this number?
Exactly. And the problem you face in Intel, and I suspect it still exists, but in my day, here are the key facts, because you never have the whole story in Intel. Here are the key facts. Here's my assessment. Here's other alternatives. You owe them that. Your assessment's not the only assessment. It takes a very arrogant and destructive person to say their assessment is the only valid one. Trust me, there are other valid assessments, because you never have all the facts until after it's over. Then it's too late. The Intel officer's job is to present the decision maker with facts and assessments that decision maker can use to make a future decision.
Right, and we saw this problem with President Bush, where he wasn't very savvy on foreign policy, but he surrounded himself by foreign policy leaders. However, many of those leaders belong to the neoconservative group of thinking, and they presented that perspective. So a lot of the decision making, it seems that what's come out after his presidency ended was based off of just neoconservative thinking, where a lot of the rest of the foreign policy community is saying, well, what are you doing? This doesn't align.
But that's not unique to the Bush White House. When Clinton had a similar problem, it just weren't neocons, and I'm sure this president does too. And the problem is, sometimes you have, for example, Colin Powell is definitely not a neocon. Colin Powell is a brilliant strategic thinker. But one of the problems we have today, the internecine politics within every administration, is the fight for the president's ear. And one of the things that had happened to Colin Powell very early is he was marginalized, put on the outskirts of the decision making. The result is his impact was far less than it could or should have been. They also tailored what he saw. And so This is a problem with every government and every administration. You know, the Russians were surprised by the German invasion in 41, even though 11 analysts went to Stalin and said, look, or 11 analysts or military commanders said, look, everything we have indicates the Germans are coming. They even had reliable intelligence on the date. But Stalin didn't believe it, so he executed them. Well, after you've executed 7 or 8 people, and when the next guy that shows up tells you what you want to hear. So let me look at the next, the final indicators here. If I go to the slide that starts with 30 November, you'll notice this intercept. The only real thing out of this indicator is it tells you something very, very significant is about to happen. And then 6 December, that's an interesting timing. You do the timestamps. That could have told you that whatever was happening, it was intended to set the stage before 7 in the morning in Hawaii. You could make that interpretation today. Whether they wouldn't have made it, I don't think, at the time, because they were focused mostly on Europe. And of course, the Japanese deception effort fits in there as well. If we could, let's take a look at this map, which shows the task group's route to the U.S. If you look up there, northern Japan, Hokkaido, where the carrier battle group started from, the deception group was 90 miles southwest of them, between the 2 major Japanese islands there in the north, continuing to transmit as if they were doing routine operations. And so they were only about 6 days out of Hawaii before the deception group went silent. And so anyone who was tracking the Japanese and believed they were coming to Hawaii would have drawn that line out and said, okay, they'll be here around the 14th. And so even if we had looked at it and said, okay, they left, we're 90% certain they've left, and made the assessment of when they'd get here, we would have been off by 6 days. So the most important indicators of the attack were tactical indicators that were either mistaken, they thought they were the B-17s, or in the case of the Ward, which I think was the most serious missed indicator, they engaged a submarine, and the duty officer decided that, well, I want more information before I'll tell anyone important. I'm not going to wake up the admiral because you shot up something in the water. That induced a 2-hour delay that might have had a significant impact on the battle. Picture if that information would have gone to General Shortstaff and planes would have been launched, or if just the fleet was manned up and had their guns ready. The Japanese still probably would have inflicted some losses, but they would have suffered heavier losses themselves.
So we're running short on time. We're only have a few minutes left. What are the biggest lessons that come out of Pearl Harbor?
I think the biggest lessons are threefold. Number one, when you start thinking of what you're doing to the other side in the dispute, you need to develop what we in the military call likely courses of action. How do you think they will respond? And sometimes when you do that, it deters you from doing something overly extreme. During the China-Taiwan crisis in '96, I was on the operational planning team. We prepared 3 courses of action of likely, on the intel side, of likely Chinese responses to the courses of actions that were being recommended. And it was interesting that as we went through the approval process, the courses of action that would lead to the most, or that would most likely to lead to the most aggressive Chinese response were swept off the table right away. It wasn't worth the risk. And in one case, it was because it had would have had a long-term impact on our relations. So we were looking to deter aggression without creating a problem bigger than what we were trying to prevent. And to do that, you need to develop, here's what we want to do, but I need to have, the decision maker needs to know, how is the other guy likely to respond to that? That's one lesson. The second lesson is the most critical information related to your combined mission. Of course, we're joint today, so this lesson's probably being applied every day. But if you have a piece of information that you don't understand the meaning to, you need to share it with those who share your mission. And the third one is never assume your enemy can't reach you or touch you. The minute you make that assumption, they can and will.
Wow, this has been fascinating.
Thank you.
You know, one of the best history lessons I've ever had.
Well, thank you.
Well, thank you guys for tuning in, and we hope to see you next week on The Whole Gamut. Have a great day.